Okay, so welcome to our panel session, which is titled Renewables are Key to Decarbonising the Electricity System by 2035, but what are the challenges and how do we get there? So in the break, we had a poll, which has now disappeared. So yeah, thank you. We had a poll question around what the barriers are. And as you can see there, the top issue that's come out is grid capacity and stability. Then we've got planning and consenting process, and then slightly less important as we go along, policy being unfavourable and uncertain, and then land acquisition. And interestingly, which was not the case 10 years ago when we were doing sessions like this, the availability of capital and finance is right down at the bottom with anti-wind campaigners. So it's really great to see those two barriers completely removed in the last sort of 10, 15 years. In terms of the session, everyone's done a great job scene setting off the back of COP27 with a cost of living crisis and some political upheaval, we'll call it, in the last few months in the UK. There's lots to discuss in this area. We've got just 45 minutes to talk about the issue, so I'm relying on our expert panel for their succinct yet insightful answers, and I hope to have a bit of an interactive debate using Slido, so please do follow the code on the screen. If you go to slido.com, put that code in, you can ask questions, and I'll try and pick those up throughout the session. So we heard in the last session, our last few speakers talk about natural capital and that really important emerging area. So what I would like to do to transition into our session really is talk about, is there a conflict between the new measures around natural capital and biodiversity and the need to develop new renewable energy projects and infrastructure and achieve our 2035 decarbonising the whole electricity system goals. So I'm going to go to you, Matt, with that question. Is there a conflict in relation to those two things? Matt is here from Natural England. He leads on green finance, natural capital market development, and works on strategic solutions to enable sustainable development. So if I could pass over to you, Matt, please.
Thank you. So is there a conflict? Well, I mean, there shouldn't be a conflict if our sort of shared ambition is to develop a sort of a low carbon and high nature future, and we heard a lot about that this morning. Then there shouldn't be a conflict. Those two things should work together, and I think in lots of places, restoring and creating natural capital, helping landowners develop new business models, developing new markets, that all works together with the renewable energy sector. There's a sort of a range of nature-based solutions that work in that space. Sort of, we've heard this morning about peatland restoration, woodland restoration, then you've got seagrass creation, salt marsh creation. So from that perspective, there shouldn't be, but then I think the reality is there is sometimes a conflict, and I think that's sort of quite challenging and probably problematic for nature conservation, because we should be in a position to enable, renewable development to tackle climate change. I think historically, we have objected to solar and to onshore wind and to other developments, and I think that's caused some cause for thought actually about whether that is the right approach. If you look at the approach now we're taking to offshore development, which is to work sort of upfront with the industry to find strategic solutions that enables large-scale developments, I think that's probably the approach that we need to take in the future to enable renewable energy. An example that sticks in my mind from it is from years ago, it's not recent, but we sort of consented an offshore development and then objected to the onshore infrastructure. I mean, that sort of approach is not the sort of joined up thinking that we're going to need, and I'd like to think we've shifted some way. The next step, though, is if you recognise that the energy system is a grid that requires connection. If we're going to solve a nature crisis, we need to build a nature recovery network across the country, not a series of isolated and protected sites. And I think only by working in a sort of a new partnership with industry are we really going to be able to do that. And I'd like to think that's sort of what we're on the path of trying to do at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you, Matt. As you saw from the poll, the availability of grid connections and grid stability is a big topic in this area, and so I'm really pleased to say that we've got Steve Halsey and Hugh Taylor on the panel. So Steve is Distributed Energy Resources Development Manager for UK Power Networks and is responsible for delivering service level improvements to customers looking to connect low carbon technologies to UKPN's 3 licensed distribution networks. And Hugh Taylor is CEO of independent specialist grid consultants Road Knight Taylor and sits on the expert connections panel for all 6 of the UK's DNOs. His team is advising on some 250 large-scale UK projects, totaling over 10 gigawatts. So we saw from the poll, and I think it won't surprise anyone to say that grid connection and capacity are top on the list of issues. But is that fair? And what are the challenges for the national grid and DNOs and their role in meeting our targets? I'd be really interested to hear from you, Hugh, on this. Maybe you could perhaps do a bit of a very quick SWOT analysis of what the challenges are for the grid and DNOs. So what would you include in that analysis?
Thanks, Andy. And I'm not going to pretend that Andy didn't actually give me preparation, a little bit of time, because a SWOT analysis of the networks, that's obviously a bit of a challenge. And also, I want to be really honest here, I'm not in the slightest bit technical, so I did actually have to go and speak to some people in my team to get these answers, and they'll come out as verbal diarrhea, of course, and apologies for that. But I'm interested by that sort of about 50% of you thinking that grid is the greatest challenge. If you were to poll the developer community, and the developer community achieves a connection application success rate, so this is, if you look at the percentage of connection offers that they actually accept, so how successful are the applications that they put in, they have a connection application success rate of under 15%. And the success rate at planning is well over 80%, even though the average scale of a project has gone up from under 5 megawatts, which was down at 2015, to over 30 megawatts now. So it is the big one. However, there is light at the end of that tunnel. First of all, there is a direct correlation between the amount of expertise that you point at a grid problem and the results that you get out at the other end. So my team achieve a connection success rate of over 80%. It is a kind of a slightly extraordinary, rarefied team, but does just demonstrate that it doesn't have to be so bad. So just very quickly on the SWOT analysis, and I'll try and do this without boring you all silly. So first of all, the strengths. There's resilience, innovation, and people. So we're very lucky to be working with the foundation here of what is an incredibly resilient network. So it's designed and it's built and it's operated in a way that is just unlike most places in the world. So we're very lucky in that regard. And talking about most places in the world, we also, when it comes to innovation, we absolutely lead the world. So our network operators, including UKPN, where Steve's from, are absolutely leading the world. So of the top 10 independently ranked network operators in terms of network innovation, we have something like 5. So we do 5 of our 6. So we do completely dominate, and you can see the results of that by the fact that we have actually connected an awful lot and contracted to connect an awful lot of renewable technology that essentially the grid wasn't actually designed for. And you wouldn't achieve all that if it wasn't for the extraordinary people that we've got within our networks. And I think that the people within the networks and the expertise held within the networks is actually what I think we should all be hanging our hats on, because that's really quite cool. So weaknesses, first of all, is resource. So the first weakness is the people. The fact that there are very few of them, and they are spread incredibly thin. And simply, if you look at the engineers, they just simply don't have the time to be able to do the very best thing by all of their customers. So connection applications come in, they have guaranteed standards from Ofgem, and they have to just knock these connection offers out. And so bad decisions are made, but through no fault of the engineers on the whole, I would say. The second thing is inertia. So I think Storm Arwen was quite interesting. We all saw when all of those wood poles blew down up in Northern Power Grid's area and Spens as well. We all saw the public reaction to outages. And unfortunately, outages just absolutely trump everything. And there is inertia. There are sort of individuals within network operators for whom that is absolutely everything. And Storm Arwen didn't help in that, because the press really did pounce on some of the specific network operators, that actually it's the thing that they are now most worried about. And if we had a balance between health and safety, which is absolutely key, obviously, keeping the lights on, which is obviously very important, but also enabling decarbonisation, I think things would be a little bit better. But that's the sort of the first kind of two weaknesses: the people, and then that kind of mindset that we've got. And then the last thing is policy. So that's the technical, commercial, regulatory policy framework that's incredibly complicated in many different layers, that those system planners, so the extra high voltage network engineers, that they're operating under. And unfortunately, they are really, really constrained. And I've just got a couple of examples of where this regulation lets them down, for example. At the moment, and Steve is incredibly familiar with this, at the distribution level, when you get a certain amount of generation contracted to connect, they look at the reverse power flow going up through supergrid transformers, where it steps up, I guess, to national grid from 132,000 volts to 400,000 volts. And that bottleneck, when you reach a threshold, then you need a new supergrid transformer. And a lot of these grid supply points, in order to put more generation under those grid supply points, and those grid supply points can cover hundreds of square kilometres, unfortunately there just isn't the capacity. And in order to enable more generation, then you have to, the first customer that triggers the reinforcement has to pay for a new supergrid transformer. That's 12 million quid. So that is a massive blocker, and just about any developer that knows their salts would kind of agree with that. There's also, and Ofgem had an opportunity to address this. I won't talk about the significant code review too long because it will bore you all completely senseless, but they didn't address it. And there's also something called the high cost cap at £200 a kilowatt. That means for just a 5 megawatt project, you can be paying £1 million in network reinforcements, because they're not socialised if you're below that level. So those are a couple of kind of technical points, but just to slightly bore you, but also just to demonstrate that Steve and his colleagues are actually constrained. But also there are technical policies within each of the DNOs that are at odds with what other DNOs have, and some of them are really positive and enable more deployment of more renewables, and some of them don't, and that's something that absolutely needs to be addressed. Just in terms of sort of policy and modelling, as some of you will know, National Grid now, that 400,000 volt network, and also the transmission network in Scotland, is the big pinch point. And so we've got really long delays, up to 2036 now for some projects to connect. And bearing in mind we want to decarbonise the networks by 2035, that's clearly, I can do the maths on that myself. That is a real problem. But National Grid is now, at last, has said that they're going to change the way that they model storage. So there are 290 projects contracted to connect to National Grid's network alone, which is an awful lot. 110 of those are storage. So sort of 290 that are delayed by reinforcement works, and 110 of those have got storage in them. So they're now suddenly, which is brilliant, they're going to model storage at 0 megawatts. So they had been saying it's contributing to the problem. They'd be better if they said it's actually helping the problem. They're saying it's sort of it's net neutral, which means that suddenly a lot of projects, and a lot of you will be dealing with projects now, and you probably wouldn't be aware that this is only just happened, this decision, that they will have connection offers come out again next year that will have far shorter timescales. But they will also have connection offer milestones as well, so that clearing out the queues is a really big, as a lot of people know, there are a lot of projects out there that aren't moving. So clearing out the queues and National Grid having the ability to do that is absolutely key. And so another really big opportunity is the significant code review, which is a change to the way that network charging is charged, I guess, is going to be really significant. And that's going to give the networks the opportunity to be far more strategic than they have been able to recently. So instead of just looking at an individual project, looking at the individual impact on the network and then saying, well, you have to reinforce these 100 metres of circuit or this grid supply point, whatever it might be, not grid supply point, lower voltages than that. So instead of that, they can actually look at it more holistically. And that should open up far more opportunities for connection of generation and demand. So that's a massive opportunity. If only the networks had more people to actually take the time to do that properly, it'd be great. If any of you have got children or grandchildren who are looking for a career to go into, please point them at engineering and get them into the networks. And then
Steve, I'm gonna give you a 30-second warning.
Sorry, I knew I was going to go on far too long. So then the threats, a really big threat is the significant code review that I just said is a really big opportunity, because as Steve will tell you, there's going to be an absolute tidal wave of connection applications that are going to come in, and that's going to block this already constrained system that's under-resourced, and also the connection timescales associated with the reinforcement work. So that's going to create are going to be absolutely huge. And also Ofgem is about to give its determination on the ED2 business plans for the networks, and that is likely to be a car crash as well. I would put money on that they're actually going to be thwarting the kind of development that we need of the networks that would enable more renewables to be deployed. And other than stopping developers poaching from the networks, which isn't helping, that's it. Sorry, I went on too long.
Thank you so much, Hugh. I give you a lot more time because Matt had been very efficient with his time, and also it came top of the list of concerns. So, Steve, as the only representative from a DNO on the panel, I am conscious that there was a lot in what Hugh just said, but do you have any responses to that, or any comments that you'd like to add to the challenges for DNOs?
Where do I start? Where do I start? I almost need some more paper, Hugh. So just so we're nearly timed out. And for non-technical, you managed to get a whole load of stuff in there. GSPs, reverse power, brilliant. Perhaps I'll try and tackle some of those in some sort of order, I guess. It's probably well understood that capacity on the network is in some way constrained or is some way difficult to get hold of. Hugh mentioned the number of projects that are accepted compared with the number of ones that DNOs have to deal with, and that's quite a small percentage. And as Hugh mentioned, DNOs don't necessarily have the luxury of picking and choosing. They have to deal with all of their inquiries they receive. So if 15% are accepted, that means potentially 85% of my staff's time, our staff's time is wasted on projects that don't actually go anywhere. Hugh mentioned that the size of projects, the 5 megawatts to the 30 megawatts, yes, we've seen a massive increase in the threshold at which the projects are there, and that takes a greater level of expertise. And again, as Hugh mentioned, I think is the people challenge, potentially both a strength. We've got an awful lot of experienced people, but with the upturn of work that we have seen, an upturn of inquiries, then potentially not enough people. So health and safety, keeping the lights on. Yeah, health and safety for us as a DNO and all of the networks is absolutely paramount. And there isn't a single meeting that I go to internally within our organisation where health and safety isn't top of the shop. And that is absolutely vitally important. And that affects what we do, how we do it, when we do it. And that helps us to keep the lights on in a good fashion. you mentioned that, yes, I am only one of 6 DNOs here, and I'll give some of my views on some of those in relation to that. But, of course, there is National Grid, and Hugh touched on the 400 kV network. There is the National Grid network that sits above the network that DNOs own. And the pinch point currently seems to be at that interface between DNOs and National Grid. And we've found ourselves, most DNOs now, distribution network operators, find themselves in a position where capacity, there is no upstream capacity on the National Grid network for allowing any of that generation to get back onto the network. But having said that, UK Power Networks, we have connected in the last 10 years over 5 gigawatts worth of renewable generation to our network. I think Hugh mentioned something about, and that connection to a network that really wasn't designed for energy flowing in that reverse direction. That the whole National Grid network was built on the basis that energy flowed from typically fossil fuel power stations back through to customers. We're now pushing energy flows in a different direction, and that presents us with challenges. Hence, Hugh mentioning the reverse power flow element. So yeah, that pinch point on the networks, most DNOs are now finding themselves in a position where all of the GSPs, grid supply points, have limited capacity. If I talk about our East of England network in particular, so UK Power Networks covers all the way sort of from the Norfolk coast all the way down to the south coast and London in the middle there. In the East of England network, we have, I think it's 18 grid supply points, and pretty well 16, 17 of those find themselves in the position where there is that limited capacity, or that we can't actually connect some projects until 2028, 2029, 2030. Hugh mentioned 2036. Now that obviously is presenting some problems. So interestingly, innovation was mentioned by Matt earlier on. I think Hugh's mentioned innovation. Innovation is absolutely key to getting some of those projects off the ground. So UK Power Networks, when they first found out that capacity on the grid network was in some ways challenging at the beginning of this year, so 10, 11 months ago, we instigated what is called a regional development plan or regional development programme with National Grid, and that allows us to look at pieces of network holistically from a distribution and transmission network combined. And we are currently working our way through the first 10 or 12 grid supply points that find themselves in that position to find ways of getting those projects connected earlier than the date of the delivery date for those reinforcement works. That will possibly involve some form of curtailment. Now that curtailment could be at certain times of the day, it could be at certain seasons, typically just summer or winter. And that will allow customers to connect earlier, but by having some form of curtailment. Now, many customers said that can work. It allows them to connect. It will allow them to generate some revenue from their projects, whilst those reinforcement works are being delivered. But it's probably important to realise before we even get to that stage, I mentioned that we've got 5 gigawatts connected. We have also got, within UK Power Networks alone, 5 gigawatts of projects in the pipeline that have accepted their project to connect, but are slow moving for one reason or another, or are not quite connecting in the timescales that they anticipated. So they could possibly...
I'm going to stop you there, Steve. I think that's a great time because we're going to be moving on to the developers who perhaps are moving slowly with grid connections. Who knows? So I just want to introduce Peter Bolton. He's Investment Director for Renewable Energy within Gresham House and is responsible for the unsubsidised renewables and co-located battery energy storage system within the New Energy team. He focuses on greenfield and development stage projects in the UK. And Jenny Thompson, who has more than 15 years experience in the renewable energy sector and is currently Senior Land Manager dealing with wind, solar and green hydrogen assets for Statkraft. So I'll come to you first, Peter, and then you, Jenny, with the same question, which is basically, what are the opportunities, challenges and solutions for renewable energy projects and the grid to meet our targets? And I'm going to give you 5 minutes each. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So, yes, I suppose speaking on behalf of the investors, it might just be worth clarifying what the scale of the potential problem is. So right now, most people see UK electricity coming approximately 40% from renewables. So the question here is, how do we make that 100%? Maybe by 2035, maybe that will extend. In order to do that, you also need to recognise that most consultants anticipate that total electricity demand itself is going to double over that sort of time period. We're now electrifying how we heat our homes and how our transport network works. So we're looking at something in the region of a 4-fold increase in today's current renewable energy capacity to solve the problem. I suppose the good news, or the strength, if you want to look at it that way, is that there is a community of investors, as the poll suggested, that are very content to invest in new renewable capacity. It's got a predictable set of cash flows. It's got a reasonable return, and therefore, and there are projects coming through from the developers as well. So really, that's not the issue. It's getting out of the way of the investors and the projects in terms of them being brought to fruition. So grid factors is obviously hugely important in making that improvement. Planning is another big point. Certainly the previous PM was talking about whether there should be a clamp down on the amount of new solar projects granted planning permission, and of course other unexpected policy. Renewable generators are going to be caught by a windfall tax, which seems, I suppose, at odds with trying to create an environment for a 4-fold increase. So hopefully there's a sort of a positive message to take forward. And there's another thing that Gresham House in particular are very keen on, which is the role of storage. So we have we manage about 30% of GB's storage, or battery energy storage. And we think that's going to play a very important role. Firstly, you can't suddenly expect to flood the grid system full of intermittent renewable generation, where the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, unless you have a means of storing that power. And clearly, batteries have a great role to play in that. We're also seeing a great opportunity to co-locate physically at the same site, sharing a grid connection, the batteries with the renewable assets themselves. They don't necessarily interfere with one another. They can work in harmony. That will enhance the returns to the renewable component of the asset, and then bring in even more investors who want a pickup on their returns to justify, again, the investment required for a 4-fold increase. So I know that Jenny's going to speak more about storage as well, so maybe I'll hand it over at that point.
Thanks. So from my perspective, Statkraft is the biggest renewable generator in Europe, so we've got a real vested interest in making this work. And the results of the poll were interesting because I think we would see it in the same way. Our biggest challenge is around grid, but we've also got concerns around planning and policy. So with the developer hat on, I think that the challenges and the solutions that we can help with are mainly around grid services and grid stabilisation, and also matching demand to supply, or supply to demand, through storage. So in terms of grid stabilisation, I think everybody knows now that as we put more renewables onto the grid, it can lead to fluctuations in frequency, and that needs to be stabilised. Statkraft is working on greener grid parks, and in simple terms, they are a power station turbine but without the power station. So you put power in, it turns a huge turbine wheel, which is really heavy, it's got a lot of inertia, and so regardless of small fluctuations in the incoming frequency of the electricity, it keeps turning at a constant rate, and we can put electricity back onto the grid again at a stable frequency. Our first of those projects is operational now in Scotland. We've got some more in the pipeline, and I think there's a press release going out about that later today if anyone's interested. The other challenge that we can help with is around storage. Peter's talked about batteries. They're great in the short term. They can help with storage over minutes and hours. They can also help with frequency stabilisation. Where we've still got a gap is around storing energy over days and weeks. Statkraft's background is in Norwegian hydroelectric power, so it's quite natural that I think we see a solution to that in pumped hydro. Pumped hydro is quite simple. You have a top reservoir, you have a bottom reservoir, and a pipe between them. At times when you've got a surplus of power, you pump water up to the top. At times when you need electricity, you feed the water back down through the pipe over a generator, and we can put electricity back onto the grid. To give some idea about how much storage potential there is for pumped hydro, there's a utility scale project that's currently being mooted in Scotland. It's not one of ours, but it's a good example. And that can store enough electricity, if it's put forward, for about 3 million homes for 24 hours. So there's a lot of potential there. The final project that I wanted to talk about is green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is generated by taking renewable energy and using it to split water into its component parts. Green hydrogen can be used as a storage solution because you can generate power when you've got a surplus, store the hydrogen, and then put electricity back onto the grid. At Statkraft, I think we're more interested in it at the moment as a fuel source in its own right. And the reason for that is that it opens up sites to us that don't have a grid connection. So at the moment, we're working on a project in West Wales. It's a great site. It's an MOD base. It's previously been consented for 2 green energy projects, neither of which went forward because there's no grid connection. We're going to look at it and put in, hopefully, solar turbines, and then all of the power that's produced by those renewable sources will go into our electrolyser, and we don't need to be able to export electricity. So suddenly that site becomes viable for us. Ultimately, our hope is that that green hydrogen could be used to power Welsh public transport in areas that wouldn't be suitable for electrification. So that's a really exciting project for us. I think if I can sum up with 2 points, I'm a land manager, so I'm going to go back to land points. And that is that the opportunities for us are that this brings forward projects that don't need a grid connection. So that opens up opportunities for us in new locations. And it also means that where we've got projects where we can generate, by plugging in ancillary services through grid services or hydrogen production, we can just tip the financials a bit and bring forward projects that previously we couldn't have worked on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jenny and Peter. I just want to remind everyone of Slido. The code's up on the screen. Even if you don't want to ask a question, you can upvote and influence me to ask questions. We have 9 minutes left for questions. I'm going to take the first one from Slido, which is for you, Matt. And it says, this is from Tim Holmes from Endurance Energy. And he said, Endurance Energy are finding a lot of public opposition to solar farms with grid unaware of the BNG benefits. Can Matt do more to influence national policy? So over to you, Matt.
Well, I won't comment on national policy. It's probably not safe for me to do so if you're especially if you're recording things. But I think the wider point is about our perception, our relationship, isn't it, to the natural world? I think that we really got to address. Solar. You know, there are some solar sites I know of that deliver huge BNG benefits. I think that there's one we're dealing with that's up to sort of 65% gain on the site. But I think that's at the upper reaches of it. But I suppose the perception is it's a sort of a mechanical intervention in the countryside, and then people are going to object to it. We've got to find a way, I think, of resetting the debate, you know, and our relationship with the natural world, especially if you're going to solve, you know, some of the figures that you just mentioned there, Peter, the amount of energy that we're going to need to generate over the next sort of 20, 30 years, it's going to need a whole-scale sort of rethinking of our approach to land. So I think maybe the one thing to look for is some sort of comprehensive land use framework that enables you to make some of these balancing decisions between energy, food, you know, nature, nutrients, housing, all of those things. And that's maybe what's lacking. And there is debate about that at the moment and some work in preparation inside DEFRA.
Great, thank you, Matt. The next question I'm going to ask, I'm probably going to come to you, Hugh. It's the key issue, and Steve, you might want to pick up on it as well. The key issue seems that users triggering a substation capacity increase has to pay for all of it, rather than spreading it between beneficiaries. How do we resolve that?
Yeah, it is a key issue, but only under some grid supply points. And it's quite simple, really. You just socialise the cost. So at the moment, there are a number of grid sites, as we refer to them as, so grid supply points, that are what's known as infrastructure sites. And those infrastructure sites, because of a quirk in policy, those costs are already socialised. So if you do happen to be the triggering party, you're not actually paying any of those costs for that new supergrid transformer. And so it would be relatively straightforward. Ofgem had the opportunity under the significant code review to go up from 132,000 volts and include those SGTs, and they chose not to. And it was very disappointing for everybody. But it's an incredibly simple solution. Steve?
Yeah, it should be, shouldn't it? And many of the rules, regulations and policies that Hugh referred to were written many years ago, pre the sort of demand for generation connections. And many of those policies were written on the basis that there was a single customer typically driving the need for that reinforcement, and pretty well everywhere across the country now there isn't a single customer driving that need. So we as UK Power Networks have tried to find a way of dividing those costs up between all connecting customers. Again, that becomes incredibly complex, and even on the simplest one that we've got at the moment, we've got 6 customers that are looking to connect, so we've tried to divide the cost up. £10 million, just over £10 million between those 6 customers, and it is dependent upon all of those 6 customers proceeding. If one customer drops out, then the other 5 customers will need to pick up the cost. So it can very easily have a domino effect, especially if the first project that drops out is the largest project or the one with the biggest contribution to that. So, yeah, it could be solved by changing the policies and changing the rules to allow those costs to be socialised either at a distribution level or at a transmission level.
Great, thank you. We've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to take 2 more questions. The first one, I'm not sure you're going to want to comment too much, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. So how do we... the question's moved whilst I was reading it. Why did we sell the national grid? The private owners do not want to forego profit for helping connect renewables, and should we renationalise it? Does anyone want to pick that one up?
It's quite a thorny one.
Yes.
I mean, I've spent enough time working with the public sector, and apologies to anybody here who is in the public sector, to know that there are weaknesses in decision making in the public sector. And this is a thorny topic, but for me, I've worked with the networks enough to know that whilst there are some challenges in terms of the motivations within the networks, and on the whole, we have brilliant people trying to do the right thing, and I think better regulation of the existing model for me. I mean, it makes me weep, the idea of having the public sector take over the networks, but maybe that's just a few bruising experience with the public sector, but that's my take on it.
Thank you. I won't come to you, Steve, because I don't think you can answer that question. The next question is around batteries, so I'll come to Peter or Jenny if one of you wants to shout on it. Do you see a barrier around the government battery manufacturing sector an issue? Gigawatt factory uncertain. Anyone want to pick that up?
Okay, I'll put my hand up and say that I think our main concern is around supply chain for batteries, and obviously, the areas they come from, we're worried about, is it being ethically sourced? What damage is it doing extracting metals? Are people being paid the right amount? Have they got proper working conditions? So, and supply chains are quite difficult to investigate because you can only get so many steps down before you're trying to work out subcontractors of subcontractors. So we've definitely got real concerns around that. And, you know, do we need it to be manufactured in this country? Well, not necessarily, but we need to see that it's being done properly. And also, I think the other thing is that technology is moving on, and we would like to see better solutions that don't necessarily involve the same amount of extraction of metals.
Great, thank you. And then I've got one more question, which is up for grabs, but also something I would like everyone here today to think about and how you can take some action after the conference. So it's, how do we convince current government that renewable energy is the answer to many of our energy security, energy cost, biodiversity and climate change problems?
Let's
Anyone?
vote them out. Yeah.
I suspect they already know. It's just whether all of the barriers can be removed within the speed that they hope they might be.
Right. I'm gonna add something myself. One of the things I find really frustrating is when I was sat there watching the news and we're talking about, you know, potential blackouts in the winter, and they're talking to renewable energy generators, and that's who they always have there. They never have a representative of the grid. These are the specialists that we really need to be talking about blackouts, because in reality, I think in the UK, on any given day that we're going to struggle, it's probably going to be a transmission problem rather than an energy generation problem. So my call to Hugh and Steve and your PR teams is to make sure you're on TV talking about the issues that might actually cause the blackouts, because obviously the media like to talk about blackouts because it's an exciting issue for them, but they're not really addressing the concerns that we have as an industry.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of blackouts, I mean, it's conversations around that have really sort of come to light since the Ukraine crisis, and that's largely driven by the lack of availability of gas, or the potential lack of availability of gas. So there is still a large amount of energy generation within the UK that comes from gas. So I know, because I've already had some early dealings with some typically landfill sites, biogas sites, who have been approached by government, by BEIS, to look to use some of their existing capacity they have and install new generators to ensure that they can switch from non-mains gas power generation to make available additional capacity. I think it's probably fair to say there's been talk of potential shortfall. Capacity margin, I think, is the terminology used by National Grid. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we haven't had rotor disconnections yet. Whether we have it this year or not, I don't know. The weather's been extremely kind to us here in sort of November. It's still not very cold, so I'm hoping that that won't actually come. But as DNOs, we will get an instruction from National Grid if that's what we need to do, and there is a well-trodden path of how those rotor disconnections should happen. But I'm hoping we won't be there.
Great. Thank you, everyone. If you could thank the panel in the usual way.